right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I am Charlie Harp, the CEO of Clinical Architecture, and today I'm going to be talking about the Patient Information Quality Improvement Framework, or PIQI for short. PIQI is a standard approach to scoring data, and what I'm going to do is kind of give an origin story and an overview of the PIQI framework. So the idea of a patient information framework was kind of built on this notion that as we share data, as we get data from somewhere else, people care more about the data they receive than the data they send. And so how can we assess the data we're getting to see if it's usable and acceptable for the things we want to do with it? Now, I started this journey a little over a year ago, was doing some work with the QHIN, was doing some work with ASTP, and in coming up with a framework, I landed on a handful of design principles that I'm going to go over real quick. The primary objective of PIQI is to provide a common approach for assessing patient information in flight. Like I said, I'm getting data from elsewhere. I want to assess if it's good. And I also want to do it regardless of the message format. So whether it's FHIR, X12, HL7, OMOP, CCDA, because even though FHIR is something that a lot of people are kind of leaning into, it's not a majority of the way people receive patient data today. So we need to have something that is agnostic of the format to be able to assess the payload that's actually inside whatever the format is. So the design principles that we landed on was, first, we need to have a simplified model, a least common denominator, where I could extract the data regardless of the format so I could assess it. The second is we wanted to have a taxonomy so we can understand and classify the types of problems I'm seeing so we could kind of do a root cause analysis to figure out why the data was going wrong in the first place. We wanted to create, since PIQI, the design of PIQI is really a community-based model, we wanted to have a way where we could define assessments and share them within the community so that we're not all reinventing the wheel, even though we kind of like to do that in healthcare. And the last thing is the ability to create user-definable evaluation profiles. So I tend to think of this as a scoring rubric. And the idea is, if you're getting a score and you want to be able to talk about it, everybody else needs to understand the nature of that score. So for example, if I create a USCDI version 3 rubric, then anybody that's evaluating against that rubric, a message should get the same score so that it's comparable and it gives you kind of a level playing field for assessment. So the first principle is the simplified model, and because I'm not a big fan of reinventing the wheel, I just leaned on US Core and USCDI. Because if we're doing a data quality assessment, we're going to assess the things that we care about, and in this case, the things were expressed in the USCDI model. And so that we're going to call the PIQI information model, and it's a very flat collection of objects. So you have a patient with demographics, you have labs, meds, et cetera, and the way we've chosen to express that is in JSON, but you could do it in XML as well. The next thing is the healthcare data quality taxonomy. The healthcare data quality taxonomy is kind of like a foundation of what needs to be there. And if you think about it, things like, is it available? I can't assess the quality of something if it's not there. Is it available? Is it accurate? Is it conformant if it's something like a piece of terminology, which we use a lot in patient data? And then if you do all those things, I call that eating your vegetables, then you can assess interesting things like plausibility. Like, is this unit of measure valid for this LOINC code? Is this condition appropriate for this patient? So you can start to look for things that might make you feel that maybe this data isn't right. Maybe there's something wrong with the data. And so that's the HDQT. And this is a first draft. I imagine as time goes by, we'll add more things to this. The next thing is a simple assessment module. A simple assessment module is a composable service endpoint. Essentially what I mean by that is, it's intended to be a simple API interface where you give it a standard thing and it returns pass, fail, or I couldn't do the test. That way, anybody can build a simple assessment module, anybody can build content for one, and the mechanism behind the interface could be a stored procedure, it could be a standard value set execution mechanism, it could be a terminology server, or it could be a RESTful endpoint. running into some kind of a large language model. So the ability to create and deploy different assessments is kind of unlimited. And parameters can be added, and a SAM sits on top of other prerequisites. And I'll try to give you an example of that, but well, I'll wait till I give you the example. So here's the example. So if you have SAMs like the attribute is populated, the attribute is a valid date, the concept is complete, it's valid, it's active, it's conformant or compatible with the code system that we agreed on. And if I were to employ, when I use the SAMs, I say this type of thing takes in a simple attribute, or it takes in a lab, or it takes in a medication object. I can pass parameters. So for example, if the concept is compatible, I can say, here's the code system we agreed on. We said it was going to be LOINC or RxNorm or RxNorm and NDC. And then you have prerequisites. And with the prerequisites, the bottom line is when I say I want to check to see if this concept is compatible, that's the gate that I'm setting for the SAM. But to be compatible, I have to be valid, I have to be complete, and I have to be populated. Any of those things can fail and stop me from passing the test of compatibility. So a SAM inherently has prerequisites that exist. So when you deploy the SAM, you can see where the information is breaking down. And I've got an example later that makes that more clear. And then of course, every SAM is tied to a dimension in the taxonomy. So when you're looking at SAMs across a collection of messages, you can say, well, our biggest problem is people aren't populating the fields, or our biggest problem is they're not giving us the code system for the coded elements. So you can see that data the way the taxonomy kind of lights up when you look at data in the aggregate. And the last is the evaluation profile. So an evaluation profile is basically the scorecard itself. So it says in this example, for USCDI version 3, and if you look at the lab test entity in the model, I can say that for the lab test, it's got to be LOINC. And if it's not, I'm going to score that. The lab order has to be LOINC, and I'm also scoring that. The value should match the type. So if it's a string, it should be an ST. If it's a number, it should be a number. The lab unit should be in UCOM. The lab specimen type should be a SNOMED. The result status just has to be there, and I can also say, does the lab test semantically match what it's mapped to? And that's just informational. Not everything has to score. So let's talk a little bit about scoring, and I have a more detailed thing later if I get to it. Everything that you score against the model is worth a denominator point, and every gate you pass is worth a numerator. So at the end of the day, PIQI gives you a simple numerator-denominator. Now you can weigh it, and you can also say certain things are critical. So even if they're not, the score isn't bad, if I'm missing things that are critical to my use case, I don't want to consume that data. Because the ultimate goal of PIQI is you generate a score, and then you can decide if you want to gate the content, if you want to accept the content, and you can also do that in the aggregate. And I'll show you some examples of that. And so like I said, you can weight it and you can set the criticality of it. So let's talk about scoring. And I might go through this really fast because of the time we have today. So when you're scoring in PIQI, there's an individual message score. There's data class and entity statistics. So how are my labs? How are my meds? How are my procedures? And then there's SAM statistics. So the entities say what passed, and the SAMs say what failed and how did they fail. So here's a walkthrough. So I get a patient message and I'm just looking at the lab data. And in this particular thing, I'm just assessing if the lab test is compatible. And in this scenario, the attribute's populated, it's complete, it's valid, and it's compatible. That's my assigned SAM. So when it goes through, I get a point for that. I get a point for the numerator and I get a point for the denominator. So my message score for this guy is 100%, 1 over 1. My entity statistics for lab tests is 100%, 1 over 1. And I have nothing in my SAM statistics because I didn't fail anything, okay? For this next one, the concept wasn't valid. It was populated, it was complete, but it's not a valid code. So I can't go to the next level and get past the gate. So I got 0 points out of 1. And my individual message score was 0. My entity statistics, if I'm accumulating, is now 50%. 50% of my lab test passed. And my SAM statistics for lab test is I have 1 fail because the concept was invalid. And I know this is a lot. Okay. In this last example, I also failed because the attribute wasn't populated. It's kind of the same drill. I don't get any points. My aggregate score is 33%. So my quality score for all the data coming from this source is 33%. And when I look at my SAM statistics, I said your lab, the labs that failed 50% of the time was because it wasn't valid, and 50% of the time is because it's unpopulated. So when I look at that information, it allows me to go back to the source and say, here's why your score is only 33%. Does that make sense? Okay. The thing that I had to drill into the engineers of clinical architecture is you don't get a point for every SAM. You get a point for passing the test that I assigned. You fail using the SAMs, but you succeed by getting past the final gate. And that's important. And if I had a condition, because the SAMs can have a condition, like for example, if I'm looking at a lab test, I'm not going to ding you for points if there's no unit of measure because it's not in UCOM. So there's a condition that says if there's no unit of measure, I'm not even going to run the score, so I don't get a denominator point, so it doesn't hurt my score. Does that make sense? Okay. So the assessment process, you get a patient message, and the first thing you have to do is you have to do the canonical alignment, which basically is ripping the data out of whatever container it's in. And one of the things we're putting on the PIQIFramework.org website is a guide for here are the fields you pull out of HL7v2, here are the fields you pull out of FHIR. CCDA is a little more interesting, but the idea is here's where the data should come from to put into the PIQI model. You align that to the canonical model. You choose an evaluation profile. That aligns the model to the evaluation criteria in the SAMs. The SAMs align you to the healthcare data taxonomy. And so when you run the message through, it generates statistics and it generates a score. So in this case, you got a 67%, but there are 17 critical failures. Now, what you do with that when you get it out the other side is really up to you. And right now, PIQI has 3 modes. The first mode is it just chipper shredders the data and returns a score. The second mode is it doesn't return anything, it just puts data in statistics repository. And the third mode is a verbose mode or an audit mode where it returns the original message to you and it marks it up with an audit trail to say this is why you got the score. You failed here, you failed here, you failed here, and that's why you got the score that you got. The other nice thing about PIQI is it's designed to be a data-driven model. So the PIQI model itself is extensible. If I want to add new things to the PIQI model, I can. If I want to add claims elements to the model, I can. It's a very flat model. Ideally, we'll evolve it as a community through the PIQI Alliance, but somebody could extend the model. The HDQT, reading glasses can't see from here. That's also data that can evolve over time. The standard code systems, well, that's just a terminology server. But the things in green and yellow, your library of SAMs, that's all data definition. How you execute it, data definition. Your evaluation profile, we're going to be working with folks to create a standard CDI 3 and 2 evaluation profile. We've talked to folks in other organizations who want to create a standard usability profile that they publish, but you can also create your own. You can take one that exists and you can extend it, and in the community, we should be able to share that. We can get out of our silos and work together on some of these things because data quality is an important thing. And some of the SAMs, like for example, you can have a SAM that says the code's got to be in this value set. And the little box down here, this guy, that's a standard value set reference package. So for example, this LOINC code should have this unit of measure in UCOM. That's stuff that you can deploy, you can plug in, and we can share that as well. So the other idea behind this is the PIQI Alliance. Now, clinical architecture, we build products, and we are building a product around this called the Pixel Gateway. and I'll be talking about that at booth 1349 later today. But the idea here is, within a community, us creating a standard way of scoring the data so that we can all agree and uplift the data together is important. And so we're going to be pushing this through HL7 as a standard. We've started that process. We're very excited about it. If you go to PIQIFramework.org, and I've got a QR code at the end of this presentation, you can go and see the documents that I produced, and those were produced, you know, with a lot of heartache for me because I hate writing documentation. But there's a message format guide, there's kind of a PIQI handbook, there's a SAM guide, but the idea is, you know, together we can work on model extensions, and I'm not going to read these slides to you. We can figure out how we can deploy and use these simple assessment modules. We can come up with standard evaluation profiles, like for example, I'd really like ASTP to sanction a US CDI version 3 rubric so that anybody, because you know, we have a PIQI engine, but we're going to deploy this and we're going to create an open source version that we're going to put out on GitHub so people can download a reference implementation of the PIQI engine. But the idea is, if you download the US CDI version 3 rubric and you install it in your PIQI engine, and I run a message through that, I should get the same score no matter where I run that. And so that's the idea. And if you're interested, go to the PIQIFramework.org website. We're going to be working with Levitt Partners to kind of manage this whole thing as a open source community. And let us know if you just want to be kept in the loop or if you want to participate and be part of the decision-making process. Now, this is just an example, because you might say, Charlie, it's great. I can score one message, but what does that do for me? Scoring one message gives you the opportunity to see whether that message has data problems in it. But the real power of something like PIQI is when you start accumulating data from a source over time. This is real data. So we're in a beta process right now with the Pixel Gateway. And this is real data coming from a source. And what you can see is, you know, I've got a threshold score. And for this guy, I can see the number of messages with critical failures. I can see the overall number of messages. And I can see the quality score as it goes across. In fact, up here with my two data sources, I can see that one of them's at 76% and one of them's at 72%. But that's with US CDI version 2. That's not US CDI version 3. When I run this exact same data through US CDI version 3, they're both in the mid 50 percentile in terms of score. This next thing is when you drill into a source, what you can do is you can actually identify what are your biggest problems. When I look at the different elements that are coming through in the model, what are the relative scores and which ones are critical? And in this case, for the medication drug, why is it failing? So 4% of my failure is the medication is invalid, 30% is because the display is unpopulated, and 66% is because you've given me an invalid concept. So it's not RX norm and it's not an NDC code. With this, I can look at the data classes. So I can see for the data classes coming through, where are my critical failures? Where are things coming through that are all good? And what's my overall quality score when I look across those? And what's my quality trend? Because remember, the second I in PIQI is improvement. PIQI is not just there to measure, to punish. The idea is I can understand why, and I can go back to the source and say, these are the things that if you address them, your data quality is going to be good, and I'm going to accept your data. So here's where you could go back and say, hey, your immunization stuff is great. In fact, the data coming from this source actually had lot numbers for everything. It was really cool. I'm kind of a data nerd. When I see real data, I'm like, but this is your ability to do that. And you can also go in, and when you look at data coming from a source, you could do a compare and contrast. So let's say we're live with US CDI version 3, and US CDI version 4 is coming down the pike. You can create a US CDI version 4 rubric. You can deploy the data through it. It's because it's flat and it's relatively performant. You can see what your score is, and you can start to figure out, how do I start to remediate that now? So when the time comes when I have to do that, how am I going to do that? There's other cool things you can do, like the plausibility stuff I think has a lot of potential. You can also measure for things that are duplicative. So you can say, in this channel, I've got this amount of duplication. And you can also look at a channel and say, I'm never getting a mammogram from this source. So you can look for things that are perpetually missing, not necessarily from a scoring perspective, but just from an informational perspective. How come you're never sending me a mammogram? Something's not wired up correctly. And some of these things are really important for me to be able to see them coming through. So am I out of time? Ladies and gentlemen, that's a high-speed, low drag, and I'm out of time. Thank you so much for your attention today. And please stop by 1349 if you have any questions. Thanks.